February 12, 1837. The humid air of southern Louisiana hung heavy over the small, forgotten plantation on the outskirts of the Mississippi swamps. Morning mist clung to the cypress trees, bending low under the weight of centuries of decay and neglect. The kind of mist that hides more than it reveals, that carries secrets in its damp breath. Among the fields of withered cane, the faintest traces of footprints appeared, the marks of a life forced to move silently through the shadows. They belonged to a woman named Zora, a slave whose name few remembered, whose story even fewer would dare recount aloud. Zora was 34 at the time, a mother to a child barely old enough to walk, and she carried with her the weariness of years spent under the oppressive eye of her master. Her life had been one of careful compliance, hidden resilience, and quiet observation. She knew the schedules of the overseers, the rhythms of the guards, the patterns of the plantation dogs. She moved like a ghost among the living, unremarkable at first glance, but with a presence that demanded subtle attention. Her hair was thick and dark, usually braided close to her scalp, her hands roughened by years of labor, yet deft in tending wounds or gathering herbs. Those who lived alongside her often overlooked the depths of her knowledge, the whispered remedies, the small rituals, the charms of protection inherited from generations who had survived by wit and will alone. On that morning, as Zora prepared her meager breakfast near the edge of the cane fields, she felt a presence in the mist. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, the distant bark of a dog too precise to be coincidental. The hunters had arrived. Word had spread across plantations. A mother, daring to claim even a sliver of freedom for herself and her child, had escaped. The rumor inflamed the fears of the enslavers, and they dispatched men whose duty was to reclaim what they saw as property. These were no ordinary men. They were relentless, skilled trackers with whips, bloodhounds, and an understanding of fear. Zora knew them by reputation long before she heard the first echo of their approach. She moved silently, the child secured against her chest with a tattered shawl. Every step was calculated, every rustle of leaves measured. She passed through shallow water that mirrored the gray sky above, knowing the hunters would follow the more obvious paths, expecting her to flee straight rather than weave. Her mind, trained for survival, counted the beats of each step, the direction of each breeze, the subtle signs left by passing creatures. But there was more than human danger in the swamps. Zora had been raised with the knowledge of forces that few outsiders acknowledged. Hoodoo magic was not mere superstition here. It was a line of defense, a language of spirits, a shield against those who sought to bind her body and soul. As the hunters pressed on, voices distant but growing, Zora reached a clearing where the water pooled unnaturally, black as ink. She knelt, whispered the names of ancestors, and drew a series of marks in the mud, careful, deliberate. Tiny offerings of cornmeal and charcoal were sprinkled in arcs around her. She murmured words older than the plantation itself, phrases designed to confuse, to mislead, to protect. The hunters arrived moments later, their voices sharp, dogs straining at their leashes, eyes scanning the shadows for the movement of a fleeing figure. They passed through the clearing without noticing the subtle distortions in the air, the faint shimmer that indicated Zora had called upon unseen allies. A chill rippled through the mist. The dogs hesitated inexplicably, their instincts disrupted. Witnesses later recounted that the hunters found only confusion. Footprints doubled back on themselves, paths appeared where none had been, the air thick with an almost tangible tension. Some claimed to see lights flicker in the fog, though no lantern had been carried. Others spoke of hearing voices whispering in the low, guttural tones of the swamp, mocking their pursuit. Whether these were hallucinations or manifestations of Zora's hoodoo, no one could say with certainty. What is certain is that the hunters' confidence wavered for the first time. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. The insertion of those words might feel abrupt, yet the pause in the narrative mirrored the real tension. A breath in a chase that had stretched for hours, where every movement carried life or death weight. Zora's escape unfolded with meticulous care. Each swampy inlet became a potential trap for those who followed her, a natural obstacle she manipulated with her knowledge of terrain and ritual. She had memorized every shallow pool, every fallen cypress, every hidden burrow that could shield her child. Around midday, the hunters split, one group continuing along the muddy tracks she had left, another attempting to flank her. But the ground seemed to betray them. Roots that should have been solid gave way beneath their weight. Mud clung to boots in impossible quantities, and the dogs, so keen for scent, returned whimpering, as if touched by an invisible hand. By the time night fell, the pursuit had taken a toll. The hunters, exhausted and increasingly paranoid, camped at the edge of the swamp, fires flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. Some swore they heard laughter on the wind, high-pitched and fleeting like a child calling out. Others swore the shadows themselves seemed to shift, to form shapes that mirrored human figures before vanishing. None could pinpoint the origin of these phenomena, yet all agreed on one undeniable fact: Zora had vanished. Investigation in the following weeks revealed contradictions. Reports placed her in one area, then another, yet no physical evidence supported these claims. Plantation records showed her absence, yet no trace was ever found in the usual hiding spots along rivers or in abandoned cabins. Some believed she had been ferried by sympathetic hands, others that she had invoked powers beyond comprehension. Scholars and detectives in the decades since have noted that Zora's escape challenges conventional logic, suggesting intervention of a nature few are willing to formally acknowledge. Suspects in aiding her were never fully identified. Enslaved neighbors whispered of a network of allies, midwives, herbalists, laborers, all familiar with protective rituals. Some historians speculate that her knowledge of Hoodoo was central, a skill passed from mother to daughter, honed for situations precisely like this. Law enforcement at the time dismissed such explanations as nonsense, yet they documented repeated failures to track her. Grave files assembled from court testimonies, overseer diaries, and slave narratives all point to one conclusion: Zora's disappearance was orchestrated with unparalleled cunning, blending physical agility, strategic thinking, and spiritual intervention. The psychological impact on the hunters was profound. Letters and journals reveal men obsessed, restless, haunted by visions of the swamp. Many abandoned their pursuit entirely, some for months, others permanently. No conclusive explanation ever reconciled the gaps in the narrative. To those who studied these events, Zora's survival became not merely a tale of escape, but a testament to resilience under impossible conditions, a quiet assertion of autonomy against forces determined to erase it. Even today, the story echoes in the bayous. Fishermen and wanderers report fleeting glimpses of a lone woman moving through fog, uncatchable, always one step beyond comprehension. Some dismiss these as folklore, others as lingering memory of the events in 1837. But the records, however fragmentary, suggest more than mere legend. They suggest a calculated act of survival, aided by knowledge and practices that remain largely hidden from mainstream historical accounts. The swamp, thick with mist and decay, continues to guard its secrets. Zora's fate after that night is largely unknown, though the fact of her escape is indisputable. Her story, meticulously reconstructed through fragmented evidence, serves as both a warning and a guide, that even in the darkest circumstances, knowledge, courage, and cunning can alter outcomes in ways that defy expectation. Her legacy, like the swamp itself, remains a place where human resolve meets something older, deeper, and profoundly enigmatic. The night after Zora's disappearance stretched long and oppressive over the plantation lands. The hunters, though seasoned and ruthless, were unsettled. Sleep eluded them. Some claimed they heard whispers moving through the cypress knees, a language neither French nor English nor any tongue they could identify. Others described fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond their lanterns, shadows too deliberate to belong to animals. In the morning, small traces suggested passage, footprints that split and vanished into nothing, areas of mud that appeared churned yet bore no definitive shape. Evidence, such as it was, contradicted itself at every turn. The overseers, desperate to reclaim what they considered lost, sent a second wave of men. These were younger, hungrier for reputation, with less patience for subtlety. They combed the swamp systematically, breaking branches, cutting through cane, and dragging dogs through shallow waters. Zora's understanding of the terrain, however, allowed her to manipulate their expectations. She moved in loops, doubling back where paths intersected, leaving false impressions of direction. By the time the hunters realized they had been led astray, several hours had passed, and the sun was beginning to fade behind thick, rolling clouds. Zora had prepared for this. In the days before her flight, she had gathered knowledge from those who practiced the old ways. Hoodoo, a system of spiritual, herbal, and ritual practices, was her shield. She had not relied solely on superstition. Cornmeal sprinkled to confuse trackers, protective markings on trees, whispered invocations to the spirits of the land. Each element was deliberate. When the hunters' dogs faltered, when shadows seemed to distort, these were not accidents but manifestations of careful planning, honed by generations who understood that survival often required bending the natural order. By mid-afternoon, the hunters found signs that unnerved even the most practical among them. Canoes that should have been visible lay hidden beneath thick moss and roots. Footprints doubled back in impossible patterns, and small fires, meant perhaps for warmth or signaling, had been extinguished before the men could notice them. Several hunters later recounted the sensation of being observed, though no human figure appeared. A few claimed to hear laughter, high-pitched, almost like that of a child, but impossibly echoing from multiple directions at once. Local witnesses, enslaved and free alike, later provided fragmented accounts of what transpired. Some saw a figure gliding across the swamp's shallow waters, too fast and deliberate for a person burdened with a child. Others mentioned strange lights in the canopy, small orbs that moved independently of wind or current. No official records corroborated these phenomena, yet they persisted in oral histories, testimonies that, while dismissed at the time, would later form the backbone of any serious investigation. Zora's knowledge of hidden waterways proved critical. By dusk, she reached an inlet known only to a few in the region. The water was black and thick with vegetation, yet she navigated it with precision. Here, she paused. She fashioned small markers, subtle, almost invisible, that would mislead anyone following her trail later. Then she performed a brief ritual, a circle drawn in the mud, small offerings placed at cardinal points, words murmured in a language older than the plantation. The hunters, approaching hours later, found nothing but the distorted landscape, traces of movement that seemed to contradict each other, and an eerie stillness that unsettled even the boldest. Some of the men began to question their mission. Letters discovered in private collections decades later reveal panic and obsession. They described dreams of a woman appearing in flames, laughing or shifting shapes, followed by animals speaking with human voices. One hunter's journal recounts seeing a woman taller than the trees, her eyes fire, beckoning us into waters where we should drown. While the reliability of these documents is debated, the pattern is consistent. Every man involved in the pursuit experienced inexplicable phenomena that derailed conventional tracking methods. Meanwhile, Zora remained undetected. She moved with her child through the swamp's labyrinthine channels, pausing only where she could ensure safety. Her survival relied on combining natural cunning with ritual practice. She avoided open paths, instead using overgrown inlets, hollowed logs, and camouflaged depressions in the mud. Every encounter with hunters was anticipated, every misstep predicted. She exploited the fears and superstitions of those who pursued her, turning instinct against them. Investigators attempting to reconstruct these events later faced contradictions. Plantation records suggested her flight covered an impossible distance in a single day. Eyewitness accounts varied wildly in time and location. Hunters, logs conflicted, as did diaries and letters. Scholars attempting to reconcile these sources found themselves in a maze of uncertainty. Some concluded Zora relied on a network of allies, others emphasized the impact of her hoodoo practices. And a few insisted that natural conditions alone could not account for the hunters' repeated failures. By the second night, the hunters had split. One group remained near the main river, attempting to block any escape by water. Another pressed deeper into the swamps, expecting to flush Zora toward the river. Neither succeeded. Reports from the time described frustration so intense it bordered on hysteria. Animals fled from the hunters. Strange lights glimmered in the mist, and the men began to lose confidence in the rationality of their mission. Those who abandoned the chase entirely often cited fear of supernatural interference, though this was rarely admitted in formal accounts. Zora's escape illustrates not merely cunning but the deliberate manipulation of expectation. By exploiting the swamp's natural features, her own agility, and the spiritual practices at her disposal, she created an environment in which conventional tracking failed repeatedly. Every misdirection, every false trail, and every unexplained phenomenon served a purpose: survival. As dawn approached on the third day, the hunters' morale had collapsed. Exhaustion, fear, and disorientation compounded. Footprints and tracks disappeared entirely, as if erased by the swamp itself. Zora, carrying her child, had reached an area rumored to be beyond their reach: dense, impassable thickets surrounding a series of shallow lagoons. Here she paused, performing another protective ritual. Small talismans, carefully hidden, would continue to obscure her trail even after she moved on. By this point, the hunters were scattered, demoralized, and increasingly unwilling to continue. Some returned to the plantations. Others wandered lost for hours before retracing their steps. The mystery of Zora's final disappearance remains unresolved. Oral histories suggest she reached sympathetic communities further inland. Some accounts claim she eventually found refuge in a settlement along the Mississippi, where she lived under a new identity. Others insist she continued to harness her knowledge of hoodoo to remain invisible to those who would pursue her. Physical evidence is scarce, yet the consistent pattern in testimonies and letters indicates that her disappearance was deliberate, carefully orchestrated, and effective. Grave files assembled decades later emphasize the duality of her strategy: natural cunning reinforced by spiritual practice. Tracking records, combined with swamp geography, indicate that the hunters' failures cannot be explained solely by terrain or fatigue. The repeated anomalies in their pursuit, vanishing footprints, disoriented dogs, auditory hallucinations, sightings of light, point to deliberate intervention. Zora's mastery of both the physical and the mystical created a scenario in which escape was not only possible but highly probable. Her story serves as both an account of survival and a study of human belief and fear. Those who pursued her encountered the limits of rationality, confronted with phenomena they could not explain. Zora, in contrast, demonstrated a methodical application of knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge that allowed her to manipulate environment, expectation, and perception. Her legacy is, therefore, multifaceted, a testament to resilience, an exploration of the intersection of folklore and survival, and a reflection on how unseen forces, both human and spiritual, shape outcomes in extreme circumstances. The morning after the hunters' third failed attempt was gray and silent. The swamp seemed to breathe, its mist curling around broken branches and shallow water with a patient, almost sentient quality. Plantation overseers, frustrated and humiliated, dispatched word to neighboring estates, warning of a woman who had eluded capture for days. They framed it as a simple problem of property lost and duty unfulfilled, but privately, fear and disbelief dominated discussions. No enslaver wanted to admit that a single mother, with no aid beyond what she could carry herself, could outmaneuver men trained for pursuit. Investigators, both official and informal, began to compile reports. Diaries from overseers, letters from hunters, and recollections from enslaved laborers formed a patchwork of testimony, contradictory, incomplete, and sometimes deliberately misleading. Some reports claimed Zora had moved east along a narrow river channel. Others insisted she had been seen west, moving toward thicker swamps. Many accounts described strange lights, unnatural fog, or sounds that could not be explained. Scholars decades later, poring over these records, noted a disturbing pattern. The more meticulous the hunter, the more disoriented they became. Precision and experience did not prevent failure. If anything, they amplified the psychological effects. Letters discovered in private collections reveal a growing obsession among the hunters. One man wrote of dreams in which Zora appeared in multiple forms, laughing as he stumbled through the swamp. Another documented dogs that refused to track her scent, barking instead at empty air. These were men accustomed to the logic of pursuit, yet confronted with phenomena that defied rational explanation. To the investigators, this raised a fundamental question. Was the swamp itself an accomplice, or had Zora intentionally manipulated perception to such an extent that even trained trackers could not succeed? Hoodoo, as it was practiced in the region, offered tools for both protection and misdirection. Cornmeal and charcoal, invoked in specific patterns, could confuse trackers. Charms hung from branches or placed at crossroads acted as deterrents or signals. Incantations, spoken quietly to spirits of the land, were meant to invoke assistance or protection. Zora, born and raised in this tradition, combined these practices with her own observations of hunter behavior. She understood instinct, expectation, and superstition, and she used each to her advantage. The result was a pursuit in which natural and supernatural elements intertwined, leaving the hunters exhausted, paranoid, and increasingly unreliable as witnesses. Some escaped testimonies hint at a network of sympathizers. Other enslaved individuals may have provided brief shelter or guidance, though direct evidence is limited. These accounts, preserved in oral histories, suggest that Zora's success was not purely solitary. Even so, she carried the burden of protection for herself and her child alone, relying on careful planning and precise timing to avoid detection. Her movements were deliberate, measured, and informed by deep familiarity with the swamp's geography and hidden passageways. The contradictions in the official record became central to later investigations. Logs and diaries were inconsistent, times of sightings did not align, distances traveled were implausible, and multiple hunters described the same phenomena differently. Some records noted footprints that disappeared mid-path, others described animals acting irrationally. Even the dogs, typically reliable trackers, behaved unpredictably. These discrepancies puzzled scholars attempting to reconstruct events. Physical evidence was sparse. Zora had left almost nothing tangible behind. The absence of proof, however, did not diminish the consistent patterns observed. She had vanished from the hunter's reach while remaining within the swamp's ecosystem. By the fourth day, the search had shifted into a quasi-official investigation. Overseers and hunters documented each failed attempt, noting environmental anomalies and psychological strain. These grave files, a combination of letters, journals, and sparse legal records, highlight the extraordinary nature of Zora's escape. Investigators later concluded that conventional pursuit methods were insufficient in situations involving both environmental complexity and intentional misdirection. Zora's ability to manipulate both reinforced her survival and confounded her pursuers. Reports indicate that her final movements before complete disappearance involved a series of small, deliberate diversions. Branches were moved, small fires extinguished, and footprints doubled back on themselves. Observers noted the subtle but deliberate placement of charms and symbols, though many dismissed them at the time. These marks, coupled with Zora's intimate knowledge of local flora and hidden waterways, allowed her to reach areas effectively inaccessible to hunters. Oral testimonies speak of a figure gliding through the mist, never touching the water in a way that left traces, protected by unseen forces. Whether these accounts are literal or metaphorical, they point to the same conclusion. Zora had engineered her escape with remarkable skill. Even as days turned into weeks, the psychological impact on the hunters persisted. Letters, diaries, and later interviews describe men haunted by visions and sounds. Their confidence in rational pursuit eroded. The recurring motifs, laughter in the fog, lights moving independently of wind, footprints that vanished, created an environment where belief in the supernatural became almost inevitable. Investigators reviewing these files noted that the combination of environmental manipulation, ritual practice, and human cunning had created an almost perfect scenario for evasion. Zora's ability to remain undetected for days challenged conventional logic and left a lasting impression on all who attempted to trace her movements. Some scholars hypothesize that Zora's mastery of hoodoo provided both practical and psychological advantages. Physical diversions, such as altered tracks and hidden pathways, combined with the manipulation of hunter expectations through ritual, created a dual-layered defense. The hunters, confronted with phenomena beyond their comprehension, reacted unpredictably. Their reports, when analyzed collectively, reveal an emergent pattern. Each failure compounded confusion, which Zora exploited further. The swamp, as both environment and stage, amplified these effects, ensuring that her disappearance was nearly total. Zora's child, central to her survival, likely influenced her decisions. She avoided paths that posed risks, selected areas offering concealment, and performed rituals intended to protect both herself and her young. Oral histories suggest that the child, though young, became attuned to these practices, moving quietly and following instructions without hesitation. The narrative indicates a combination of learned skill, environmental adaptation, and spiritual strategy, a comprehensive approach to survival under extreme threat. Though no official record confirms Zora's ultimate fate, circumstantial evidence and consistent patterns in oral testimony suggest she reached an area beyond the reach of the hunters. Some accounts claim she integrated into sympathetic communities inland, adopting a new identity. Others suggest continued use of protective practices allowed her to remain effectively invisible. The absence of physical proof, paradoxically, reinforces the plausibility of her success. An escape executed with precision, leaving only testimony, rumor, and the occasional cryptic mark as evidence. Months after Zora's disappearance, the swamp retained its oppressive stillness. The hunters, scattered and demoralized, returned to their plantations, though few could shake the lingering anxiety that had settled into their bones. Some wrote letters of apology to overseers, blaming exhaustion or misjudgment. Others documented visions, faint shapes glimpsed in the mist, voices carried on the wind that spoke in tones they could not understand. These records, later examined by historians, provide a window into the psychological toll exacted by Zora's flight. Local communities, both enslaved and free, spoke of her in whispers. Some claim to have seen her at night, gliding through fog-laden marshes, her child on her back, moving with uncanny speed and silence. Others told of her leaving small offerings along paths or leaving marks in the mud, symbols of protection or misdirection, warning others of danger. These stories, fragmentary as they are, form a consistent pattern. Zora's escape was not merely a flight from pursuers, but a carefully orchestrated act, combining cunning, knowledge of terrain, and mastery of rituals long practiced in the region. Decades later, scholars attempting to piece together her journey encountered contradictions that could not be reconciled through conventional evidence. Plantation logs indicated sightings in multiple directions, sometimes on the same day, with distances impossible to traverse on foot. Hunter diaries recorded unusual phenomena, dogs refusing to track, footprints vanishing, strange lights moving independently of wind. Yet no physical proof of these events exists beyond the testimony itself. Grave files assembled from these sources reveal both the consistency of certain elements and the impossibility of verifying others. Analysis of the swamp's geography highlights the ingenuity of Zora's movements. The network of channels, hidden lagoons, and overgrown paths offered natural concealment. By combining this knowledge with ritual practices intended to confuse and protect, she created a scenario where conventional pursuit methods failed repeatedly. Investigators later noted that her use of hoodoo, far from superstition, provided a tangible advantage. Hunters acted according to expectation, and those expectations were deliberately manipulated. Her escape also forced a reconsideration of human perception under stress. Witnesses and pursuers alike reported experiences that defied ordinary explanation. Lights appeared where none had been placed, sounds echoed with no identifiable source, and animals behaved contrary to instinct. While some historians dismiss these accounts as exaggeration or fear-driven misperception, the pattern across multiple independent sources suggests deliberate design. Zora's actions exploited both natural and psychological systems, creating a pursuit that was impossible to sustain. In the weeks following her disappearance, attempts to recover her proved futile. Hunters retraced paths, scoured known hideouts, and consulted with local informants, but all efforts failed. Even sympathetic neighbors could not locate her with certainty. Reports suggest that she reached a network of communities familiar with protective practices, where she remained concealed, adopting a new identity. The exact route, timing, and means of survival remain subject to speculation, yet the overarching pattern is clear. Zora's disappearance was planned, deliberate, and executed with exceptional skill. The long-term impact on those who pursued her was profound. Letters, journals, and oral testimonies indicate persistent anxiety and obsession. Men who had tracked her described nightmares and hallucinations, a lingering sense of being watched, and an inability to trust their own senses. Some abandoned tracking entirely, others returned to plantations physically intact but mentally unsettled. Scholars interpreting these patterns suggest that Zora's mastery of misdirection, combined with environmental and ritual factors, generated a psychological advantage as significant as any physical evasion. Historians continue to debate the role of hoodoo in her escape. Some emphasize the symbolic value, arguing that belief in protection reinforced her confidence and decision-making. Others note the practical application. Physical markers, natural barriers, and timing all contributed to the effectiveness of her flight. Together, these elements created a multifaceted defense that exploited both human and environmental vulnerabilities. Grave files indicate that her understanding of these factors exceeded the comprehension of most pursuers, providing a rare example of deliberate strategy under extreme conditions. Even today, Zora's story resonates in the region. Swamp guides, historians, and folklorists recount her escape as a mixture of fact and legend, each retelling emphasizing different elements. The recurring motifs, invisibility, protection through ritual, manipulation of perception, and resilience against overwhelming force, form a consistent narrative thread. While the exact details remain unresolved, the cumulative evidence underscores the skill, intelligence, and determination required to survive. In examining the legacy of Zora, scholars highlight several key themes: the intersection of environment and human ingenuity, the use of ritual to influence both material and psychological outcomes, and the persistence of memory in shaping historical understanding. Her story demonstrates that survival is rarely a matter of chance. Rather, it is a combination of knowledge, foresight, and the capacity to anticipate human behavior. By exploiting these factors, Zora created a path through danger that was, in effect, invisible to those who pursued her. The final traces of Zora's journey remain elusive. No definitive location has been identified, no physical evidence conclusively recovered. Yet her presence lingers in the accounts of those who pursued her and in the oral traditions passed down through generations. Each retelling adds nuance, but the core truth remains unchanged. A mother, facing overwhelming odds, escaped through intelligence, strategy, and an understanding of forces unseen. Her story, reconstructed through careful analysis of conflicting records, testimonies, and environmental conditions, stands as a testament to resilience. It also serves as a reminder of the limits of human perception when confronted with factors beyond ordinary experience. Hunters, trained in tracking and pursuit, were confounded. Observers, reliant on conventional logic, were perplexed. And Zora, unrecorded in most official accounts, achieved what seemed impossible: survival against relentless pursuit. Months and then years passed after Zora vanished into the labyrinth of the Louisiana swamps. The hunters who had once pursued her were gone, some relocated to other plantations, some dead, their records scattered or lost. Yet the story of Zora endured, whispered among laborers and travelers who moved cautiously through the fog-bound marshes. Accounts grew increasingly fragmented, contradictory, and tinged with awe, but a persistent pattern emerged. She was never captured, never accounted for, and in some stories she seemed to move impossibly fast, untraceable by human means. Occasional sightings were reported, decades later, along backwater rivers and hidden inlets. Travelers claimed to see a solitary woman carrying a child, gliding silently through shallow waters, often appearing in places no one had expected. Some described her as taller, almost spectral, her eyes bright in the dim light of morning fog, her movement deliberate and calculated. Others spoke of seeing lights around her, faint glimmers that seemed to shift in the mist. Many dismissed these as folklore or superstition, yet the consistency across independent reports suggests more than mere coincidence. Zora's path remained invisible but traceable in pattern, leaving only impressions on memory rather than in soil or water. In the decades that followed, historians and folklorists began compiling the fragments of her story. Plantation records, when cross-referenced with oral histories, highlighted the contradictions inherent in her escape. Reports of her location diverged dramatically, yet every account agreed on certain constants. She evaded capture, she protected her child, and she manipulated the swamp to her advantage. Scholars suggested that her mastery of local geography, combined with knowledge of protective rituals, created an environment in which traditional pursuit methods could not succeed. One particularly intriguing line of investigation focused on psychological effects experienced by pursuers. Diaries and letters discovered years later indicated prolonged obsession, recurring dreams, and auditory and visual hallucinations among men who had tracked her. Hunters reported hearing laughter, seeing lights, and sensing figures where none existed. Modern analysis interprets these phenomena as the intersection of extreme stress, environmental conditions, and possibly deliberate misdirection. Zora's ability to manipulate expectation and perception effectively weaponized the swamp against those who sought to claim her. Further research suggested that her survival depended not only on her skill and knowledge, but also on the network of allies she may have had access to. Oral accounts mention other enslaved women and sympathetic laborers who provided shelter, guidance, or supplies. While no direct documentation survives, the existence of such networks is consistent with practices of resistance documented throughout the antebellum South. These allies, operating in secrecy, may have extended her reach and ensured her continued evasion. The swamps themselves contributed to her success. Their dense vegetation, twisting waterways, and fog-filled hollows offered natural concealment. By choosing paths unknown to outsiders and exploiting hidden channels, Zora could move undetected. Combined with her rituals, small markings, offerings, whispered invocations, she created a layered strategy: physical, psychological, and spiritual. Each layer compounded the difficulty for her pursuers, who could not anticipate or comprehend the full scope of her actions. Accounts from later travelers describe encounters with figures that could have been Zora. A fisherman in 1852 reported a woman appearing silently from fog, gesturing toward a hidden passage before vanishing. A group of hunters in 1860 described hearing footsteps in shallow waters without seeing anyone. These accounts, though anecdotal, reinforce the pattern observed in earlier reports. Zora's presence persisted, though elusive, and her movements defied conventional understanding. Historians reviewing these patterns emphasize the duality of her strategy, mastery of both environment and ritual, paired with anticipation of human behavior. Zora's actions illustrate a calculated manipulation of both tangible and intangible elements, natural obstacles, misdirection, and the fears and assumptions of pursuers. Her story challenges the limits of historical documentation, as her disappearance left minimal physical evidence but enduring psychological and cultural impact. By the late 19th century, Zora's escape had become emblematic in local memory. Folklore and legend intertwined with historical record, creating a hybrid narrative that emphasized her intelligence, resilience, and command of spiritual practice. Grave files assembled during this period noted repeated references to her cunning, repeated failures of pursuers, and persistent oral accounts of sightings. These files acknowledge the impossibility of verifying many details while maintaining the consistent elements: evasion, maternal protection, and manipulation of environment and perception. Even in contemporary analysis, the mystery remains unresolved. Scholars recognize that her story cannot be fully reconciled through physical evidence alone. Instead, it must be interpreted through a combination of environmental understanding, historical context, and acknowledgement of psychological and cultural factors. Zora's ability to survive, evade, and persist in collective memory reflects both practical skill and symbolic resonance, a figure whose reality and legend are inseparable. The narrative also raises broader questions about resistance, autonomy, and agency in contexts of extreme oppression. Zora's escape illustrates how knowledge, cunning, and cultural practices can alter outcomes even in situations of overwhelming disadvantage. Her survival demonstrates that human ingenuity, combined with understanding of environment and belief systems, can create possibilities where none appear to exist. Despite the passage of time, the swamp retains its secret. Those who venture there today report sensations similar to those described in earlier accounts: unexplained movement in fog, fleeting glimpses of figures, impressions of being observed. While modern science can explain some phenomena, the persistence of these reports underscores the lasting imprint of Zora's actions. Her legacy is both historical and mythic, a mother who outwitted pursuers, who manipulated natural and supernatural elements, and whose story challenges conventional understanding of possibility. No record confirms her ultimate fate. The final chapters of her life remain lost, yet the pattern of evasion, intelligence, and ritualized strategy remains clear. Zora's story, reconstructed from fragmented records, oral testimony, and environmental analysis, offers an unparalleled example of deliberate survival under extreme threat. She remains a figure of mystery, resilience, and ingenuity, one whose legacy continues to fascinate, inspire, and unsettle. As years passed, the story of Zora remained both a cautionary tale and an object of fascination. The men who had pursued her rarely spoke of the events in the swamps again, though some kept private journals detailing nights filled with fear and disorientation. Scholars examining these texts noted recurring themes: men lost in fog, dogs barking at nothing, whispers in the darkness, and lights flickering along channels that should have remained dark. While some dismissed these as hallucinations born of exhaustion, others argued that they reflected the intentional design of Zora's escape: a careful orchestration of perception, expectation, and environmental manipulation. The swamp itself, central to her evasion, played a dual role. It was both a natural barrier and an ally. Its dense vegetation, interwoven waterways, and thick mist created conditions in which human tracking could easily fail. Hunters, accustomed to open terrain and predictable patterns, found themselves disoriented and misled. Fallen cypress trees blocked paths, shallow pools appeared as deceptively firm ground, and familiar landmarks became obscured by fog. Zora's intimate knowledge of this terrain allowed her to exploit it fully, turning obstacles into tools and the swamp into a strategic asset. Ritual practices, often referred to under the umbrella of Hoodoo, augmented her natural advantage. Small offerings, hidden markings, and whispered invocations shaped both the physical and psychological environment. Hunters reported inexplicable phenomena: footprints that split and vanished, animals acting unpredictably, and lights appearing along routes they had previously traveled. While the direct causal link between these phenomena and Zora's rituals is impossible to verify, their consistency in multiple independent reports suggests deliberate intervention. Zora leveraged both the tangible and intangible, combining physical skill with spiritual strategy in ways her pursuers could neither anticipate nor counter. Those attempting to reconstruct her movements noted that Zora's child played an active role in the strategy of concealment. Accounts suggest the child learned quickly to move quietly, to follow precise instructions, and to participate in protective rituals. Survival was thus not solitary. It was a coordinated effort shaped by knowledge, intuition, and necessity. The child became both companion and beneficiary of Zora's practices, illustrating the intergenerational transmission of skills critical for evading capture. As time progressed, occasional reports of sightings persisted, long after the original pursuit had ended. Travelers reported glimpses of a woman carrying a child, moving silently across the fog-laden marshes, sometimes accompanied by subtle lights or strange sounds. Others mentioned footprints appearing in impossible configurations, or paths that led hunters into loops before disappearing entirely. These accounts, while anecdotal, are remarkably consistent across decades, suggesting a continuity in both Zora's presence and the legends that grew around her. Historians and folklorists analyzing the grave files noted the complexity of her strategy. Conventional tracking methods failed repeatedly, yet the failures were systematic rather than random. Hunters became disoriented not by chance but by design. Environmental manipulation, ritual practice, and psychological anticipation created layers of evasion. Every decision Zora made reflected an understanding of how her pursuers would interpret patterns, how they would respond to obstacles, and how fear could be harnessed as a tool. Her escape demonstrates not only physical cunning but strategic foresight and mastery of perception itself. The psychological impact on those pursuing her was profound and enduring. Letters, diaries, and later recollections reveal recurring themes: hallucinations of movement, auditory disturbances, recurring dreams of fire and water, and a pervasive sense of being observed. Many hunters abandoned their pursuit, some for months, others permanently. The repeated failures undermined confidence and instilled a persistent anxiety that lingered for years. Scholars conclude that Zora's understanding of human psychology, how fear and expectation can influence perception and decision-making, was as critical to her survival as any physical tactic or spiritual practice. The convergence of natural, psychological, and ritual elements makes Zora's escape a singular case in the historical record. While some scholars attribute her success to terrain knowledge alone, the cumulative evidence suggests a deliberate synthesis of factors. Footprints and markers, altered paths, and ritualized interventions created a scenario in which even experienced trackers could not reliably predict or trace her movements. Her disappearance illustrates the interplay between human ingenuity, environmental mastery, and spiritual practice in extreme survival situations. Even in the modern era, Accounts of her continued presence in stories and folklore underscore the lasting impact of her actions. Oral histories describe a figure who remains vigilant, elusive, and capable of shaping perception. While these accounts may be embellished or symbolic, they consistently emphasize the same qualities: intelligence, resourcefulness, and an almost preternatural ability to navigate danger. In many ways, the legend of Zora has become inseparable from her historical reality, a reflection of both tangible events and the cultural memory of resistance. Finally, Zora's story compels reflection on the limits of understanding. The swamp, the hunters, the rituals, and the enduring oral accounts all point to a phenomenon that cannot be entirely explained by conventional evidence. Her escape is simultaneously historical, psychological, and folkloric, a case study in resilience under extreme conditions. No document records her final fate, no physical trace remains. Yet the cumulative testimony demonstrates a calculated, effective, and profoundly intelligent strategy of survival. Zora's legacy endures as a symbol of resistance, ingenuity, and the enduring power of knowledge passed through generations.